The United States makes the UN work when it wants it to work. And that is exactly the way it should be, because the only question to the United States is what's in our national interest.
My name is John, and the International Criminal Court is now in session. Today is November 25th, 2023. It's once again been another whole month since I last made a video, and for a very good reason. The lines in Ukraine have not changed that much, and I decided to hold off on another video until I felt the time was right. And I feel like the time is now, and without any further ado, let's talk about it. So, let's go first of all to the Zaporozhye front. So, as you can see all here, pretty much nothing other than maybe a few positional changes by the armed forces of Ukraine. Here, just south of Robotyne, and it appears that the Russians are continuing to hold on in this area. As difficult as it looks, the Russians have been able to hold on. And yeah, that's pretty much it. The Russians have also been talking about maybe retaking Pitagaki, but that remains to be seen if they'll actually go through with that. But I wouldn't be shocked if there was a counteroffensive here, maybe next year, to retake pretty much everything they lost from the Ukrainian counteroffensive itself. It literally wouldn't shock me. So, now we're going to go to the Velika Novosilka front, which is in the Donetsk Oblast. No changes here other than maybe some exchange of positions by Russia and Ukraine. But yeah, once again, another frozen front. Now, a front that is sort of like being discussed right now is the situation on the left bank of the Dnieper River. And I'm talking, of course, about Kranky. Now, Kranky is a tiny little village located in the left bank of the Kherson Oblast on the Dnieper River. And apparently the Ukrainians have launched some D-Day style landing operation, like amphibious assault, on the left bank settlements of the Russian-occupied Kherson Oblast on the Dnieper River. And they appear to have taken a significant chunk of Kranky. Now, the pro-Ukrainian sources, especially on YouTube, have all been hyping up about the gains being made here. But as far as I can see, the Russians, again, are holding on despite some territorial losses. And they have been striking the Ukrainians hard with ferocious might. Literally, artillery strikes, airstrikes, you name it. And the Ukrainians are now talking about suffering some heavy casualties in this area. And it seems pretty likely that the Ukrainians are either going to have to settle here, or the Russians are going to go on the counterattack and retake Kranky completely from the Ukrainians and force them back to the other side of the river. So I will not be shocked in any way if they end up retaking Kranky, thus ending that landing operation by the armed forces of Ukraine. Now, pro-Ukrainian sources like Denis Davidov and reporting from Ukraine have all been, with their clickbaity thumbnails, have all been talking about another so-called goodwill gesture of goodwill from Russia, in which they would evacuate a significant portion of Kherson Oblast, and they would allow the Ukrainians to retake it. But after what happened last November in 2022, I doubt that's going to happen, and I'm sure the Russians are going to do everything they can to hold on to these areas, especially if it means mobilizing more men to the areas. And that's why I think they will not withdraw from left bank Kherson the same way they did from right bank Kherson in 2022. Now, getting to the Donetsk Oblast, the Russians have made some major gains on the Artyomovsk-Bakhmut front. Now, for those who don't know, Artyomovsk is basically the Soviet name for Bakhmut. And yeah, I'm just going to call it Artyomovsk because that's what even Vladimir Putin himself calls it. So yeah, let's call it Artyomovsk. So on the Artyomovsk front, the Russians are basically regaining the initiative over the flanks. And especially in the northern areas of Artyomovsk themselves, everything south of Avdiivka and Yadin have now all been retaken. So all these areas here, which the Ukrainians have taken, have now all been lost to Russia. Or regained by Russia in this case. And it seems, for the most part, as far as I can see, the Ukrainians have once again lost the initiative in Artyomovsk. And it seems now the Russians are talking about an offensive towards Chasiv Yar, which I don't think is going to happen until next year. But as far as I can see, the Russians are now regaining ground near Klishivka. And I'm not going to be shocked if sometime maybe in December or in January, they retake Klishivka and maybe try to gain maybe new ground, maybe Kromove and even Evsky, which would be huge because then the Ukrainians will no longer be able to retake Artyomovsk in any shape or form, and it would basically force them to really consolidate on keeping Chasiv Yar in any way they can. So yeah, don't be surprised if the Ukrainians lose the initiative on the Artyomovsk front and they basically refocus all their efforts on defending Chasiv Yar and, of course, Hansen Tanivka, which is right here. So now, let's go to the Avdiivka front. This is the big one. Or no, let's actually go to Mariinka first before we go to Avdiivka. So, Mariinka, around 80 or 90% of it is now under Russian control, and the Russians just took new blocks, which is not that far from the town center, which all the way, by the way, is now all rubble. And yeah, this whole area here is a gray zone, though I wouldn't be shocked if that's under Russian control now. And basically, this is all that remains left of Ukrainian-controlled Mariinka. Again, just like Artyomovsk, I think everything here is all going to be under Russian control by either December 2023, which is next month, or January 2024. I wouldn't be shocked if that happens. The Ukrainians are literally losing ground and losing the momentum they've had in the Donetsk suburbs. And if you're the Russians in Donetsk city right now, you'll likely see no more maybe shellings or artillery strikes on Donetsk city maybe next year or so, because the situation in Avdiivka especially is not looking good for the Ukrainians. But yeah, to talk about it, they took the junkyard here, which is just north of the limits here. And it is reported the Russians are now entering the coke plant. By the way, they don't produce cocaine, by the way. They just produce, like, coke. It's some, like, natural resource or something. But it's not cocaine. But, yeah, they're entering the coke plant. And apparently they've already retaken or taken some buildings already. The Russians have also entered the northern neighborhoods of Avdiivka. And have also entered from the southern direction, too. In fact, Rybar has now reported, which is a pro-Russian source, that this whole area here is now under Russian control. This would make it the very first neighborhood within Avdiivka to fall to Russia. And for those of you who don't know what these blue and orange lines are, they basically represent or symbolize the 2014-2015 lines that were held by the armed forces of Ukraine from that period during the first war in the Donbass. And the Russians have now crossed that line and are now effectively in Avdiivka. I mean, there's still some force that they got to go through, but the Russians are now literally in Avdiivka. They're literally in. And they've taken their first neighborhood. So, yeah, things are not going well for the Ukrainians here. Losses are reportedly piling up. Zelensky is literally reinforcing Avdiivka itself, which I think is a really bad idea because this suburb here is literally about to be under siege by Russia, and I just cannot see them getting out if they don't pull the guys out now. Because Russians are only going to gain more ground. They're going to. In fact, there's already reports that Russians have taken Stepove. And it only gets them within firing range of one of the last roads going into Avdiivka. And there's like 2 roads left that lead out of the town itself. So, if the Russians take Stepove, and I guess maybe they take the coke plant here, game over. All the remaining roads are closed off, and Avdiivka is basically besieged by the Russian armed forces. And the only way Ukrainians can flee is basically on foot, but then Russians will just artillery strike them to death. So they literally have nowhere to go but leave. And they won't be able to take their vehicles with them. But yeah, there have also been reports of small advances in the Lugansk direction too, but not much. But yeah, let's now talk about the situation in Kiev. There have been a lot of drone strikes on this area, like kamikaze drone strikes in here. And also coming from Kiev, General Zaluzhny, Valery Zaluzhny, he was just interviewed by The Economist. And apparently he himself said in this interview, now this title is very misleading because in reality, he talked about the counteroffensive potentially being a failure. Yes, he himself has now admitted that the Ukrainian counteroffensive, or as I'd like to jokingly call it, the WOW offensive, is now a failure. ABC News, which is one of the American news agencies, has also talked about the counteroffensive being a failure. They said that the war has reached a stalemate, and that it's simply recognition, in some senses, the reality on the ground, and something we and others have already been reporting. So ABC themselves has sort of taken on the stance that the counteroffensive has ended in failure. And they also point out that the recent statements being said by Zaluzhny in The Economist will likely be used by the very anti-Ukraine House Republicans to oppose the aid to Ukraine even further. And as all of you know, the House is under Republican control, though not by much. And Joe Biden, by the way, has looked for a $106 billion national security funding request that would aid Ukraine and Israel. But the problem, though, with that is that the House Republicans have objected to this, including the Speaker himself, Mike Johnson. And speaking of which, the situation in the United States was very turbulent throughout October and November. And we went from I guess, sort of like a moderate right-wing speaker for his standards to a now more far-right speaker who opposes aid to Ukraine, at least to the way, I don't know, to the way, like, I guess Mitch McConnell would want aid to Ukraine. But it appears that Johnson has put a stop to it, and the Democrats were forced to settle for a deal that would not include aid to Ukraine and Israel. And he said, Zaluzhny, and I quote, that the slower-paced warfare of today will benefit Russia. And then they talk about, of course, ammunitions coming from North Korea. But yeah, things are not looking good here. And then he said, and this is the big one, there will most likely be no deep and beautiful breakthrough. And I agree. The problem right now for the armed forces of Ukraine is that time for this counteroffensive to succeed has clearly run out. This is not November 2022, where the Russians were struggling to consolidate their gains that they made at the initial start of the invasion in February 2022. And the Russians are now more than ever, invested in this war. And it also doesn't help that they're mobilizing more troops, and they're also getting more volunteers from Russia itself to join the army. Like few 100,000 or so men throughout Russia are coming down to the registration offices, and they're all going to Ukraine to fight in this war. And there's rumors on the streets, on both Twitter, aka X, and Telegram, that the Russians are hoping to have at least around 1 million plus men, like 1.5 million men, to be in Ukraine. And from my point of view, that is overkill. That is more than enough men to do a WOW offensive on Chernigov, Sumy, and Kharkov. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if in the future the Russians will use those men to do more offensives, not just in the Donbas itself, but also in the northern areas of Ukraine. And I'm sure throughout 2024 or maybe 2025, the Russians are going to do an offensive that will revolve around taking the left bank of the Dnieper River. And the Ukrainians know this. And that's why they've been trying to do this counteroffensive throughout the entire summer. Because they know that this is very likely their very last chance. Their very last chance at winning this war. And it's gone by. It's been 5 months since the start of the counteroffensive operation in Zaporozhye and Donetsk Oblast and in Kherson. And nothing significant, nothing decisive has happened in favor of the Ukrainians. And also things are getting worse, especially in Slovakia too. As I said, I don't know if I mentioned this in one of the last previous videos, but Slovakia has now elected a very anti-Ukraine government, and they announced that they were no longer going to aid the armed forces of Ukraine in their war against Russia. So that's like 2 countries now within Eastern Europe that have said no aid to Ukraine, Hungary and Slovakia. Poland is also sort of torn apart on the issue, but I'm sure they're going to continue it very soon, especially with that liberal government that they have elected into power. But the Netherlands, who has like 40 or so F-16s promised, that may be now put on hold because of a far-right government that just came to power. Recently fueled by the war in Israel that is taking place in the Gaza Strip right now. That will likely put a hold to maybe that, the far-right government that is. And yeah, I just don't see the Ukrainians making any significant gains on the battlefield in the long term. I just can't see it. This is not fall 2022 where the Russians were falling apart and such. This is now late 2023. The Russians are getting more comfortable in Ukraine, and it seems they're now ready to deploy more troops to all the areas that they are so keen on not just defending, but to also further expand upon. But yeah. So yeah, Ukrainian counteroffensive is a failure. The Russians are continuing to hold on, and they're advancing in the Donetsk suburbs. So that is all I got to say for today's video, everybody. So comment below what you think of the recent developments in Ukraine. And yeah, I'll see you all later. Have a good one. Peace out.